Neighbor siphoned my water. One calm valve and inspectors flipped the room. Fines, repairs, a retroactive bill, and a signed boundary. Stick around, tap like, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I did not just buy walls. I inherited habits baked into pipes and fences. The house had sat empty for years. Half renovated, dust fluent in my name. A gate that existed only as a rumor. Day one I arrived with boxes and 3 dogs and found a stranger's motorbike asleep in my garage like it paid rent. I rolled it to the curb, called a welder, and by sunset a rail gate clanged shut for the first time in years. 15 minutes later an angry fist drummed the new metal and a voice demanded the bike back. I watched through a slit in the curtain, said nothing, and let silence do the heavy lifting. I told myself the message was clear: new owner, new rules. But abandoned space breeds entitlement like standing water breeds mosquitoes, and this block had spent comfortable seasons treating my boundary as suggestion. The real parasite was invisible, pressurized, opportunistic, living somewhere in the run between his wall and mine. I did not know it yet, but my quiet line had been feeding someone else's thirst. The money was nothing, the insult was everything. Morning smelled like lemon cleaner and warm steel from the welder's torch, a metallic citrus that stuck to my tongue. I took photos of the garage, of the hinge welds, and of the chalk line where the bike's kickstand had bitten concrete, then slipped the prints into a folder labeled incidents. From the kitchen I could taste dust and hear my dogs pacing, claws ticking like metronomes on tile. They understood new territory before my nerves did. A neighbor across the lane pretended to water plants while measuring me with his eyes. When I waved he blinked slowly, like a cat deciding whether to hiss. I wrote a single rule on a sticky note and pressed it to the fridge. Boundaries in ink, not in volume. The house settled around the new gate with the relieved creak of a back that has finally found a brace, and I let that sound be my first small victory. The first clue arrived in the shower. I twisted the tap and felt the stream tiredly collapse. In this city roof tanks are normal, booster pumps the heartbeat, and soft pressure can mean anything from a municipal hiccup to a neighbor filling a kiddie pool. Under the hiss I heard it. A mechanical hum next door, steady as a generator idling. My neighbor, an old man on the ground floor with 2 rented stories above, was running his pump. 10 minutes later his hum stopped. My pressure leapt like the house exhaled. Coincidence? Maybe. I tested at dusk, waited for the hum, opened a different tap, watched the flow droop. Hum stops, pressure returns. Lather, rinse, repeat. The former owners had warned me he was furious at the sale. He liked abandoned. He liked parking where he pleased, walking through the open lot to fiddle with his wiring, pretending a property line was a friendly opinion. Good neighbors do not siphon. Those odd spikes on the old water bills suddenly had a soundtrack. I stood still and timed the pattern with a wristwatch that had belonged to my father, whispering the seconds while the hum rose and fell like a tide against my wall. I opened the meter box, brushed away a spider web the color of nicotine, and read the needle twitch during his pump cycles. It nodded yes in tiny, guilty jerks. When I set the papers on the counter, the corner curled from steam. I flattened it with my palm and felt the ridiculous intimacy of evidence. That evening I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, found a forgotten service cap half buried near the fence, and marked it with paint so a future me would not forget what a past someone else had abused. I spent 2 long days learning my house like a detective learns a suspect. I traced pipes, mapped valves, bled air, and listened with one ear pressed to cool plaster while the dogs tilted their heads like witnesses. The renovation was mid-story. Half modern, half 1990s, with mystery tees that led nowhere and a dead-end spur that kicked like a vein. I never found a clean tap-off point, but the symptom repeated with laboratory cruelty. Every time his pump spun up my pressure sagged as if my line had sprouted a straw next door. Where I live water is cheap. Principle is not. This was not about bills. It was about a man who decided that abandoned meant annexed and that my meter could be his budget line. Confrontation crossed my mind. Knock, speak plain, hope for shame. Then I pictured the script, denials, bluster, a smug claim that everyone does it, maybe even threats about connections. Legal routes exist, but slowly. Meanwhile, every kettle would hiss the reminder. Our tenant laws require landlords to provide water and power. If his rentals stood on theft and wiring older than my first phone, he had built a trap and baited it with arrogance. I did not need to spring it. I needed to stop feeding it. A better plan turned like a valve. Touch nothing of his, touch only my own. When the drone began, I would shut my mains, wait, and let physics ask the questions my temper wanted to. I chalked a rough diagram on butcher paper, valves like little crowns, T's like question marks. By the time coffee went cold, the page looked like a treasure map for a pirate who respects municipal code. I labeled the cabinet with tidy stickers. Main, bypass, garden, and felt the pleasurable click of names making chaos smaller. I could taste old solder when I sanded a cap. I set a thermos of mint tea on the sill, wrote a calm script for myself in case he confronted me, and practiced saying it without heat. This line is mine, that line is yours. Let us keep the map honest. On Monday night, I waited for the hum. At 10:42 p.m. it spun up, a hollow drum throbbing through cement. Somewhere above his ceiling, a float in a roof tank had dropped and called for water. His pump answered greedily. I stepped outside, opened my street-side cabinet, and turned my supply clockwise until the handle kissed metal. Then I waited. Here is how that story goes. The float stays low until water rises. No water, no rise. No rise, the signal holds the pump on, chewing electricity and cavitating its own throat. A healthy system trips protection. A 1990s lash-up trips nothing and prays you do not notice. At midnight, the hum still ground. At 1:30, it thinned to a sick insect. By 3:03 a.m., the neighborhood quiet broke. Hushed voices in his stairwell sharpened into anger. Tenants. No water since midnight. Another voice. Why is the power out on every floor? Tenant law in the city is gospel. Water and power are essentials. Cut them by neglect or design and you pay. I sat on my step with dogs pressed to my shins. Listening to a house realize it had eaten its own fuse. I had not hopped a fence nor touched his switch. I had simply stopped subsidizing theft and let physics, impartial and unsentimental, finish the argument. The night carried frying onion from a distant kitchen and the damp chalk of recent rain. The dogs breathed slow at my ankles and watched the cabinet as if it were a rabbit hole. I wrote times in a small notebook, pressing hard enough to emboss the page. Hum began, mains shut, neighbors quiet, neighbors restless, voices raised, light in stairwell failed. When sandals hit the tiles next door, I heard the cadence of panic disguised as anger. The unlit stairwell, the clunk of a dry tap, the accusation looking for a face. I kept still and let the minute hand grind. Patience felt like a tool with a longer handle than pride. Sunrise painted the lane the color of old copper while his tenants filed complaints. One already had a suitcase on the curb. The other called the police and read the statute about essential services. In my city, enforcement does not always wait for a judge. If you are clearly in breach, unsafe wiring, essential services interrupted, penalties land first and appeals later. The old man tried indignation, then pity, then volume. The tenants tried the law. The law won. By lunchtime, he was holding a notice for $500 and an order to return both deposits in full. Worse, he could not rent again until a licensed electrician rebuilt the fossil fuse box and a plumber certified the supply from meter to tank. Pride disguised as thrift burned his pump. Thrift disguised as pride roasted his mains. I spent the afternoon with my own plumber sealing a suspicious spur, capping a mystery T, and installing a lockable gate valve just inside my fence line where only my hand could reach. The work was clean, the receipt crisp, the ink sweet and plastic on my fingers. Across the wall, a house sulked in the heat, quiet for the first time since I moved in. Physics paused. Consequences kept ticking. The old man flapped a hand toward my gate and said words like always and before and everyone. The officer answered with words like statute and duty and essential, clean nouns that left no room for nostalgia. I texted my plumber a photo of the cabinet and he replied with a thumbs up and an arrival time before lunch. Competence has a smell, and his smelled like thread sealant and soap. He cut the old spur square, reamed the burrs, and wiped the joint like a man blessing a boundary. The torch hissed, the solder flashed, the new valve clicked with a satisfying authority. When he left, I filed the receipt behind the bills, poured water for the dogs, and stood very still to hear nothing at all from the other side of the wall. The inspector arrived under late sun, smelling of warm dust and printer ink, cap brim shading eyes that had watched this episode too many times to be surprised. "Show me what you have," he said, voice even, pen already poised. I laid out a clean trail. Old utility bills with odd spikes circled in red, my plumber's receipt for a propagate valve just inside my fence, a notebook log where each entry paired my falling pressure with the neighbor's low drone. "I have not touched his line," I said, and opened the street cabinet so he could see the clean seal and the fresh paint on my own handle. The neighbor drifted out on a ribbon of stale tobacco and grievance. "He cut me off," he barked. "I have a right to water. He must open." The inspector lifted one steady palm. "Your right to supply does not include someone else's meter," he said. reading from a small book that smelled faintly of laminate and rain. I kept my mouth still and let the folder speak while he wrote parcel numbers, noted valve positions, stood on tiptoe to photograph my shutoff from the street side, and clicked the cabinet shut again. "Here is what you are facing," he told the neighbor without heat. "Unapproved tap before the meter, unprotected pump, obsolete fuse panel, essential services interrupted. You will receive an order." Paper rustled, official and dry. The neighbor tried a smile shaped like a bruise. "Let us make peace," he offered. "Peace is the rules," the inspector replied, and left light footprints in the dust as he went. At twilight, I found a note slid under my gate, letters cut from fear and habit. "Open up or it gets ugly." The page smelled of damp cupboards. I added it to the folder behind the bills, locked the new latch, and stood in the dark listening for the old drone. It did not come. Only soft dog sighs and the small tick of cooling metal answered me, and I told myself to trust that kind of silence. By early morning, a glossy motorbike crouched across my threshold like a dare. "Private drive," I said, swinging the new gate open. "Roll it out." The old man pinched his mouth as though a lemon had turned into law. "It always stood here," he muttered. "Always came with no gate," I said, and called the non-emergency line. The patrol arrived with the chlorine smell of a station sink still clinging to jackets. One officer checked the parcel map on a tablet and drew an invisible boundary in the air with a gloved finger. "Beyond that fence is his property," he told the neighbor. "Move it or we request a tow." The tires made a sulky whisper over concrete as the bike backed out to the street. "You just made yourself an enemy," the old man said. "You just made yourself bills," I answered, not loud. At noon, a copy of a citation for blocking a private entry slid through my mail slot, ink still warm enough to curl the edge. By dusk, another sheet appeared on my gate, the kind of letterhead a cheap printer grants to a man who wishes he had counsel. It threatened damages, hinted at causation, named me dangerous to the peace of the block. I photographed it, removed the staple, and filed it between my call log and the plumber's receipt. At the tea stall, the courier leaned in and whispered, "Do not take the bait," the phrase landing like a lucky charm. After dark, my ancient fridge hummed a note that scratched the same nerve as the pump, and for one long second I mistook it for that theft song, until I heard the honest rattle that marks an appliance too old to lie. Then a real notice arrived in a sober envelope from the utility, an unscheduled inspection of the neighbor's meter branch, triggered by tenant complaints. The paper smelled of fresh ink and the deadline read like a drumbeat. A machine that had ignored rules was going to meet people whose job is rules. The engineers arrived without swagger, with the quiet authority of people who trust their tools. The air tasted of damp cement and iron filings. "Access to the meter branch?" one asked, and the neighbor, cornered by paperwork and early fines, led them beneath the stair. I waited at my gate, listening to the dogs breathe in time with my caution. From the shadow, a calm voice said, "Seen." Then again, flatter, "Tea before the meter. Jumper without a seal." A head surfaced into daylight, eyes narrowed against dust. "You cannot do that under any season," he said while pens began to move. Clipboard, camera, stamp, form. The ritual moved with patient mercy that left no escape. "There will be a recalculation for unmetered usage," the senior engineer recited. "A civil penalty, a new demarcation signed in plain language. Also an electrical safety inspection given the pump failure." The neighbor stepped into the light wearing the voice of a boy inside the shape of an aging landlord. "We can settle," he pleaded. "Cash, neighbor to neighbor, no paperwork." "The paperwork already settled it," the engineer said, not unkind, and handed me a transparent sleeve with a copy of the inspection report. The plastic smelled new. "Respect the boundary and you will sleep," the other said, wiping his brow with a sleeve that carried the honest stain of work. He turned and looked at the dead pump. "Scrap it," he added. "Buy a modern set with proper protection." The old man stared at my gate as though the bars were laughing. I slid the report behind the receipts and ran a finger along the weld seam while the metal answered with cool certainty. That evening he knocked softer than before. "Restore it and I will put things right," he bargained. "Right is not about restoration," I answered. "Right is about what the book says." He studied a crack in his step as if it might hide a loophole and found only dust. Within a week, the smell of burnt dust gave way to the clean scent of new cable and fresh conduit. On the landing, a stapler snapped, screwdrivers chimed, and a bright lamp winked over the door. "We are replacing everything down to the last lug," the electrician said. lifting a permit that looked as official as a passport. No rentals resume until this line signs off. A letter from the utility followed with a retroactive bill for unmetered draw and a neat notice of a fine. The figures sat in even columns that felt colder than a lecture. Near dusk the old man came without smoke and without swagger. "I pushed too far," he admitted. "The house sat empty and I lived like before." "Before did not include my keys," I said, keeping my tone under a lid. "We should close this," he said, eyes on the gate. I offered a page in simple language. Recognition of the boundary, no foot traffic through my yard, no machines at my threshold, no connections across lines, any work by permit and with notice, a letter to tenants clarifying that I was not the cause of their dry taps. He looked at the pen the way a man eyes a compromise with himself and signed. The ink smelled faintly of alcohol and new rules. We exchanged copies. Mine slid into the folder beside the inspection report and the plumber's receipt. His folded into a pocket that had been asking for discipline for longer than either of us would admit. After he left, the garden sounds grew louder in a way that meant nothing had changed except my attention. A soft sprinkler hiss over bougainvillea, a lizard scratching plaster, a dog chasing something kind in a dream. I threaded a pressure gauge into the interior line, watched the needle settle level as a sleeping child, and exhaled a breath I had been holding since the first hum. Out past the wall, a single hammer tap marked honest work instead of theft. The story did not end with a crash. It began to end with order. Some debts are paid in money. Some are paid in order. I did not break his door, strip his wires, or trade threat for threat. I turned my own valve, kept clean notes, and waited for the honest machines of physics and policy to meet a habit that had mistaken convenience for right. If someone builds comfort on what is not theirs, you do not need to shout. You need to make the boundary visible and give the rules time to become gravity. Keep receipts. Mark times. Photograph valves and seams. Speak at the level of what is written instead of the level of what was always done. When quiet finally returned, it was not empty. It had weight. Broom bristles at the tea stall. Sun-biting white letters that now read "No parking" without irony. A dog forehead finding my knee while I walked the fence and checked each hinge by feel. The neighbor now shuts his door without clatter. His panel no longer breathes that sour heat of overworked plastic. His stairwell has stopped echoing entitlement. It carries the lighter sound of ordinary feet. I opened my folder and moved most pages back into the archive that exists in case memory tries to rewrite facts. At the front I kept only 3 sheets. The inspection report, the official order, and the signed acknowledgement of boundary. That was the spine I needed if the past tried to repeat itself. At night I woke once and listened on instinct. City noise in the distance. House quiet under my hand. Wall still and unmusical. I touched the cool gate metal and realized that revenge is sometimes nothing more than leaving only the sounds that belong. Would you have gone headfirst into a fight, or would you have let physics and forms finish the job while you kept your side clean? Tell me in the comments, and if this story helped you draw your own lines, tap like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one.